Welcome to Dan's Talks. My guest today is A.M. Holmes, the celebrated author of several novels and short stories, and now she's doing work for HBO, making streaming things there. And I've been reading about you, and you have something in common with one of my daughters, and I consider it to be special every time I've run into somebody who went to that school. You know what I'm talking about.
Sarah Lawrence?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
They just come out very weird, including my daughter and possibly you. And you can tell them they're absolutely different from all other, usually women, than anybody else, and some men go there. But I didn't want to get started on that so much as tell me a little bit how you got into writing. I know when you were 19, you produced something called Jack, and talk about what that was.
Sure. So Jack was my first novel, which I wrote as a homework assignment in college at American University. And it was a novel about a kid whose dad was gay. And I remember the teacher said to me then, "Professor, oh, this will be very controversial." And I thought, oh, well, that was the early life. And that book is still one of the 100 most banned books in this country. And it also was always on the American Library Association best books for kids, because it's really all about a boy learning to deal with and discover his own bias and trying to figure out what does it mean to him that he has a dad who's gay, and how does that change his sense of himself. So that, wrote it when I was 19. But before that, I'd already written a play that had been produced, and I was writing poems, and and I did that as homework, because the funny thing was, the professor said, what makes you think you can write a novel? And I thought, well, I know I can't write the paper. So.
Well, you started writing, and you've taken on a genre that seems to have been created by yourself, which is to write stuff that is very controversial. I read that your the first book, or one of the first books that was really noticed, was The End of Alice, which was written from the perspective, the first person, of a convicted child molester and murderer. And there were the reviews of it I had read were either there were three kinds of reviews, which I thought was really interesting. One was, I hated it. Another one was, I couldn't put it down, I loved it. And the third one was, and which I think became interesting later on, was that it was said that you are a really great writer, that was kind of that you had to work through these emotions, or that people had to work through the emotions to learn more about, and maybe you would write something without all the Sturm und Drang that came by. Did that happen, or are you still in the midst of what you do?
Well, it's interesting, because I think about, people often describe my work as shocking or provocative. And I think I don't set about thinking, oh, I'm going to write something shocking. I think I'm writing about the world that we're living in. And the world that we're living in is filled with things, to me, that are quite disturbing. Everything from, the number of children that are abused, and that, things that were happening. I mean, that book came out actually in 1993 in the churches and all these different things. And it's front page news all around the country. And yet somehow when the novel comes out, they're like, oh my God, I never heard of this. And that was actually the reason I chose to tell it from the point of view of this, reprehensible person, was I wanted to hold us accountable morally and culturally, and say, why does this keep happening? Why are we as a society so bad at dealing with these problems? So, I think my work definitely touches nerves and threads that make people uncomfortable. But it's important to me that it be entertaining, and that it always be deeply human, because I think that that's at the core of always what I'm writing about, is human behavior. My goal is always to tell the story as kind of organically and truthfully for the situation and the characters. And I would say over the more recent years, the work has gotten a little bit funnier, and I've let out my sense of humor a little more, because I feel like that's also important, that if you can make people laugh, you can also be more serious simultaneously.
Well, you've been celebrated. You've gotten a Guggenheim. You've been given awards for short stories and prizes, and so it's been quite successful. What's the favorite? What book do you think best tells the story that you're trying to get across that you've written so far?
You know, what's interesting is I think it's on the one hand, it's a little bit like when you have children, and now I have 13 children, and they're all different and they all have their, good qualities and complicated qualities. Each piece I write is very much written in relation to the time we're living in. So the last novel, which came out in hardcover last fall and comes out in paperback this fall, called The Unfolding, was really about two things. It was a novel both about an American family that begins to kind of fall apart as it discovers its own secrets and has to deal with those truths within the family, but also about our political establishment and this idea I had quite a long time ago that both sides, left and right, had lost track of the actual American people and how to govern the country and the actual needs and desires of our citizens. And so I wanted to write a novel that was both darkly comic, but also complicated, illustrating that and illustrating the impact of what we now call dark money on politics across the board. And so that's what The Unfolding is. And I think again, in that weird prescient way, I hit the nail on the head so hard, it might've gone, straight through to the other side.
I know you wrote a book where people set their house on fire. Is this that book?
No, that's another book called Music for Torching, with this gruntled couple can't figure out how to deal with their marriage. So they accidentally burn down their house. And what's so funny is I bought this little house I've had for many years in East Hampton, probably 25 years ago, and with sort of the first actual any money I had. And I got a Weber kettle, and it was a big deal to get your own, grown-up Weber kettle, not a fancy electric one. And I remember one of the first times I tried to cook on it, I thought, oh crap, I put it too close to the house. And I remember being terrified that I was going to accidentally burn down this house was built in 1900. I was going to burn down my little house. And I thought that will make news. Nutty novelist burns down own house. Yeah.
How did you come to settle in East Hampton? I think you were born and raised in Washington.
I was born and raised in Washington, D.C., and I first came out here in about 1985. And two threads brought me out here. One was I had grown up, obviously, sort of knowing the history of the Hamptons and the artistic history of it, which is hugely important. And then I went fairly early on in my career as a playwright. Edward Albee invited me out to his barn in Montauk. And that was amazing. And I, fell in love with Montauk. And Edward used to bring the mail every day, and we would cook dinner for him. And the barn now is actually being renovated. The architect is Deborah Burke, who's another East Hampton architect, who's the dean of architecture at Yale. But at the time, the barn was really dilapidated. And just every night you thought, how many bugs will be in my bed tonight? But that was pretty great. And then I had, at the time, a therapist, in the late 1980s, who rented a little house on Beach Road in Amagansett and told me about it. And so I managed to rent that little house, 100 million years ago. And, I should have bought it, in that way that we all say I should have bought it. But I spent quite a few summers on Beach Road. And I have to say, I loved that too, because it was so, that's one of those streets that goes right down to the beach, and you literally just would roll your bike down to the beach, and it was sandy at the end. And then I would go to the farm market and I'd get my mail delivered, just general delivery, Amagansett, New York, and go to the post office and be like, do you have any letters for me? So it was pretty fantastical. And that was when, Edward Albee was around. The wonderful writer Benjamin Taylor had a house in Springs, and he would have these incredible dinner parties, and Bob Caro and just every hero you ever had would be there. It was amazing. So I've been here ever since.
I spent a lot of my youth and early years when I was running the newspaper in Montauk, and I never got to meet Edward Albee, but I knew about the barn. I think it was up by the Montauk Manor, but I never knew exactly.
Sort of. It's sort of slightly. I mean, it's on that side, but a little bit further out and up. And I would go literally to the church and play bingo at the church. And I just loved it. And I'd go to the Montauk Library. And, I mean, obviously I was there. The barn was only open in the summers. But then later, Montauk, when it would get fogged in, you couldn't see anything. And the whole town would just close in the winter. I mean, there was no,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that's when you moved to the Hamptons. I did the same thing.
Yeah.
And there was to talk about a little bit about LongHouse and what there's an important fundraiser that's coming up next week.
Yeah.
And it's important, I think, because of a lot of controversy after the founder of LongHouse passed. Right. And describe a little bit of that, and then how were you involved before that, and if not, how did you decide to join up and be part of it?
Well, I will say, I feel that I have been part of, or the East End has fed my creative sensibilities since the mid 1980s, and very, both in terms of community and also literally being out here all during COVID. It was the trees that literally kept me alive and so on. And I was fortunate several years ago to get Guildhall's award, and now LongHouse is honoring me. I'm not that aware of the details of the controversy and disruption, but what I can tell you is that Jack Larson has been part of my life since I was an infant, because in 1959, my parents at the edge of Rock Creek Forest, at the edge between Maryland and Washington, built a glass house. And that glass house had very specific drapery that was made by Jack Larson. And so literally from the time I was an infant, seeing the world and these enormous expanses of glass through these drapes that were woven, and I would say in some ways were like organic in the sense of like cell structure, literally cell structure. So that name and his work was always part of my life. And then when I first came out here, I was like, wait, Jack Larson lives here? In the same way that you would find out that the guy who drew Eloise, remember, lived here, and Edward and Robert Caro and Jackson Pollock, and just de Kooning was still alive around the corner, everybody that you were incredibly in awe of. And my dad was a painter, and my parents would come and they'd hang out with me here in the little house on Beach Road. And we went over to LongHouse, and I don't even remember if it was particular. I think it was then a little bit of a public place that you could go, but I think Jack was still living in the house and so on.
So for the listeners, tell them a little bit about LongHouse and where it is and how big it is and what it's about.
That's a good question. I don't know the entire history of it, but LongHouse was Jack Lenore Larson, who was a wonderful designer, and I knew him through his designs of fabric and textiles. But Jack Larson had a house that he lived in here, and he developed the property as both an incredible living garden of plants, but also sculptures. And he collected art and sculpture. And then at a certain point, it became open to the public to be able to visit and sort of wander the sculptures. And a few times a year, I feel like the house itself would be open. And now, since his passing, it's really being preserved, and also another sort of level of programming that's both educational about the environment and about art and meditation and things like that are starting to happen there. And the idea is to preserve Jack's legacy, but also for this place, LongHouse, to be a community both gathering place and I think an interesting place of refuge, and to contemplate, to go and look at that incredible weave, no pun intended, between art and nature. Because in the gardens, there are incredible sculptures by, some of our best craftspeople all around the world. And then also these beautiful plants that are, been growing for 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, I think it covers about 12 acres. I mean, it's a wonderful place to stroll and to go in the house itself. And I live nearby to it, and I've been there not lots of times. It's just one of those remarkable things. Like,
yes.
There's one in Bridgehampton that I can't remember his
the
name.
Madhu.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Some idea
Yeah.
of smaller. And
Yeah, but the idea of artists, and this is so huge because this is also what Edward did, of artists taking their homes and their property and making them into spaces for the future and for other generations and for the community to come and participate and be part of is an enormous gift. I mean, we now have obviously the Pollock House as a museum. We have number of spaces. There's now a new place, Una House, which is about women's art, that's in East Hampton, a modernist house. It's wonderful. And there's a lot here for both artists, but just regular people who want to be in conversation with the natural world and also the artistic world to participate in. The church, obviously, in Sag Harbor.
yeah,
Um,
it's quite remarkable. All on
Right.
account of real estate prices.
yeah, right. I mean, incredible generosity of spirit and forethought of those artists and writers to do that.
Yep.
I mean, it's important too. These are not tech billionaires. These are people who, scrappy people who
Yes,
were.
but these projects are made possible to some extent by a real estate tax, which
Yes.
is raised, I think, since it was created about 15 years ago, almost over $1 billion, I think, or some huge sum. And then a lot of it has gone to creating these kinds of art spaces out here, which is so important.
Yeah.
Most recently, John Steinbeck's house,
Yes,
house.
exactly.
It's a little half-acre house and on a residential street, and they had to spend like $15 million to save it.
Right. I know. I think 150 of that is mine.
Well, tell me what you've been working on lately, or do you live here permanently?
I go back and forth to New York. I teach at Princeton. So when I'm teaching, I go back and forth to the city because it's a long drive to be out here. But I actually I like being out here year round. I love it in the fall. I love it in the winter. It's as many people know, it's easier and it's incredibly beautiful. And I don't know. It is the landscape that feeds me. In terms of what I'm working on now, I would say it's interesting. Coming out of COVID, I did an opera. I've been writing several librettos of both adaptations of my own work, but original pieces. I did a piece for the Kennedy Center's 50th anniversary based on a monument in Washington. And then I did this opera for a company called Experiments in Opera in New York. We had 6 composers, and it was an adaptation of some of my stories. And one thing that I added that was new was this artificial intelligence talking tree. And somehow this AI talking tree that I came up with several years ago, who happens to be a therapist, has just lodged in my head. So I'm really interested in the AI talking tree and its progression as a therapist in this complicated family, but also how when it has downtime, it contemplates its own consciousness and its own identity. So I'm very, I would say I'm concerned about the world we're living in. I'm obviously concerned about the impact of AI and really interested in nature and really interested in the landscape around us and climate. And so I'm trying to weave all of that together into, I'm not quite sure what.
Well, you certainly are in the right place for that. I think there's something very special, particularly in the air, in the mists, not so much in some in Montauk, but mostly what was found by some of the artists up in Springs, just past the Springs General Store, going further up into north there.
Yeah.
It was like this dome of incredible light that people talked about as being compared to south of France, and it was so important to them. And I thought I experienced it myself and wanted to buy property there, but at the time I couldn't afford what they were asking for.
Same. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And I don't know about you, if you have those moments where you like relive the houses that you almost bought. And the one that you almost bought when it was $200,000, and the next year it was 4, and then it was 6, and then even the one that went up to 1.3, but it was a large piece of land, and then you're like, it's all gone now.
We all have those stories. I have one of buying a piece of property in Montauk for $2,500 that had beach rights for a 2-mile stretch. It's still there. And I doubled my money. I sold it for 4. It's now worth over $1 million. But I just, who knew this was all going to happen? I'm glad we all get a piece of it so that we can save so much of what we have.
I
And
do feel very lucky, and I do hope one day to be able to have an indoor shower. You know,
thank you
I'm
for,
sure I'll have to get a variance for that, but
you will, absolutely.
yeah, it's okay.
Thank you for being on the podcast. I've enjoyed talking to you. And I will see you at the opening.
Yes, and it's such a treat, Dan, because I'm such a fan of yours. You don't know that, because I'm one of those, you know, we all have invisible fans, people who know who we are, but that we don't, you know, get to say hi. And it's really is a treat.
Very kind.
I have followed your activities for years.
When is the date of the and the time at the fundraiser out there?
I believe it is the 22nd,
yes.
Which is Saturday, and I would assume it is, let's call it early evening, like 7 p.m. Not really sure. But
Well,
if you go to the LongHouse website, it'll have all the details.
Bye-bye.
And I said, come on down. Yeah.
Bye-bye. Nice talking to you.
Good to talk to you too. Take care.